So today we're really delighted to be talking about fighting climate change and borders together. When the effects of climate change are discussed, it's common to hear talk of millions of climate refugees from both right and left-wing voices. In recent years, at the same time, Europe and the UK have been expanding their border infrastructure and immigration policies to the detriment of those moving across the continent. How will these violent border regimes interact and intensify climate displacement? And what ways are there to link the struggle against border infrastructure and policies with those combating climate change? To start the discussion and to begin answering these very big questions, we're joined by Picard and Callum Muirhead, who are both organisers with Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. LGSM is a queer activist group that through fundraising and direct action stands in solidarities with all migrants and refugees. So without further ado, I'll pass it to them to take it away.
Thanks, Harry. So Callum and I will be speaking and we'll sort of switch a bit back and forth between us. So hopefully that will be smooth, but apologise in advance if not. So as Harry says, we are both members of Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. We're a group that was set up in 2015 as an LGBT group to act in solidarity with migrants. Because what we've been seeing over the last many years is that there's been an increasingly hostile and challenging environment for migrants, both here in Britain, but also more broadly in Europe and across the world. And for us as queer people, as LGBT people, that also meant that we were seeing that the right wing were increasingly using LGBT issues as a way to justify the border regime. So essentially using arguments around how migrants were homophobic, therefore we need to kind of have borders to protect LGBT people. So we recognise that as queer people, it's our duty and our responsibility, and we have a unique position to be able to challenge that and to challenge the border regime more widely. And we do that through a range of different tactics. We do fundraising for migrant groups, we do campaigning, we do direct action. That included being involved with the Stansted action, which a lot of you might be familiar with, the Stansted 15 case. But that campaigning against deportation has also included working with trade unions, working with airline staff who are involved in deportations and want to resist it. So I think what we really feel is that climate is one of those issues that almost regardless of what kind of politics you're involved with, you can't really escape it, right? Like it's something that's just coming and it's looming ahead of us, and it's also contemporarily something that's affecting everything. And it's really, really good to be here, and it's really good to have a chance with all of you, hopefully today, to kind of talk through some of the ways that campaigning against borders intersect with the organising against climate change. So I want to kind of start by talking a little bit about borders and what they are and how they function within capitalism. So I think most of us will be kind of already thinking about the way that capitalism is the cause of climate change, the driver of climate change, because of the continuous need to be extracting natural resources, the kind of how that causes rise of greenhouse gases, pollution, environmental degradation, and how capitalist states become kind of locked into a pursuit of maximization of national economic growth. But I also think it's important to think about how within that global economy, certain areas of the world become specialized within producing certain types of commodities, right? So one, I think, really good example of that is how really intensive mineral mining in Africa kind of depends on and supports the supply chain for phones made in China that are then exported and sold in the UK or in Europe more broadly. And that means that different areas of the world become less and less able to produce what's needed for the populations who live there. So borders in that context, we can think about as a way that the populations of different people who provide the labor that make that supply possible are locked in to that production. And so the wages and the maintenance costs of the labor force are lower in certain parts of the world. And in order to prevent those people from moving to places like Europe, like Britain, where they could make more money and live a bit better life, you have to enforce that violently through the border regime. And I think the reason why that's so important to remember is that both on the right and the left, a lot of arguments against immigration, in terms of borders, would be missing that really clear point that borders exist to maintain capitalist production, and capitalist production and capitalist exploitation is what drives climate change. And what we're going to see more and more of, and what we're already seeing, is that borders are used by states to maintain a sort of almost like a containment field for the crisis of climate. And so we're seeing an intense fortification of borders, more and more border controls, both externally and internally within states, and management of migration being funded both by, for example, the EU and by extractive industries. So one really good example of that is the Janjaweed militia in Sudan, which receives funding both from the kind of oil companies there and from the EU to who see it as a way to kind of maintain a control on the people who might otherwise try to get through to Libya and go to Europe. So I'll leave it there for now. And Callum, do you want to take over?
Sure. Okay, so just building on the points that Ida was making, we think it's really important that we look at how people moving due to crisis and climate crisis are talked about. The number of people displaced around the world is increasing every year, and the UN is predicting that by 2050 there will be 200 million refugees driven by climate change. However, when they describe these refugees, they use the terminology persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. And that's because at the moment we have a very restrictive legal definition of who and who is not a refugee. So just going back to the point about why people are moving, when we discuss climate change, especially in the West, we very often only see it through the lens of the media, and the media only shows very sensationalized events such as extreme weather events like hurricanes or forest fires or mass droughts. But what we don't see is the larger and much slower and more pernicious aspect of climate change, which causes things such as food insecurity, because increasingly weather is unpredictable, which makes crops unpredictable. The ocean's pH is becoming more and more acidic, and that is leading to the collapse of ocean ecosystems. And it's very important for us to realize that for a developing nation on the coast, about 50% of your protein may come from ocean sources. This coupled with rivers and water sources being poisoned by companies and through deforestation, as well as flooding and inevitable conflicts that will arise when these resources become scarce. We need to really expand our perspective of what is causing climate change, and only then can we stand in solidarity with these people. So despite being treated as a future crisis, it's already a major cause for migration in the modern world. Communities and cultures are already being displaced, and to think that this is something that isn't currently happening is very false. One of the most stark examples of this is the island nation of Kiribati in Polynesia, who have actually bought land from the Fijian government in the very, very prescient circumstance that their island nation will be lost to the sea levels. They already have prepared to move their entire culture. So it's important to know when we talk about climate change, we often also talk of it as though it's a ubiquitous thing. Everyone in the world will share the burden of climate change equally, but that's also incorrect. As with all disasters and crises, such as COVID, the burden will be shouldered predominantly by the disadvantaged. And I think it's really important that the governments and groups of people who have benefited so much from industrialization and the drivers of climate change, that we recognize, those of us who hold that privilege, that that comfort comes at the suffering of massive amounts of humans and communities across the world. And we need to recognize that and incorporate that into our discussions of climate activism. Climate activism fundamentally is about human rights, as is migrant justice. And both of these need to be firmly rooted in the foundation of international solidarity and of access to human rights and justices. The situation that we are seeing in Britain and Europe is really concerning, because the way we treat migrants at the moment, that will dictate how we treat them in the future. And at the moment, everything about British and European politics seems to say that things are only going to get harder for migrants, that they will be restricted more and more from access to public services, and will get harder and harder for them to gain entry to the country. So I'm just going to hand back to Ida.
And I think all of those points that Callum just made is kind of why it's so important at this point that we organise in a way, that we think in a way that breaks with the interests of our own state, that doesn't kind of let it define the terms in which we're thinking about climate change at all, and that we organise against borders and kind of build a solidarity that breaks down those kinds of national belongings. Because going back to the point I made earlier around the sort of global division of labour, you know, the border sort of creates that even within nation states, a sort of microcosm of that. And what we're seeing is that, you know, the British border is becoming more and more militarised. If you think about the Channel crossings, if you think about the way that that's being talked about and the kind of resources that's put into, you know, in the militarised way, policing that. In Europe as well, you know, you're seeing on the kind of borders, warships being brought in, drones being brought in, but also in other places such as with the US and the US-Mexico border, how militarized those are becoming, and how that really demonstrates how states are kind of fortifying in this very militaristic and very really worrying way their borders. The other thing that I think is important to think about is both the expansion of an externalization of borders. So, for example, by placing kind of refugee camps outside of or on the borders of the states. So in Europe, you see that with the refugee camps in the Greek islands, whereas in Australia, you have the kind of islands with the what are really like prisons where migrants are kept, but also simultaneously it's internalizing the borders. So in Britain, with the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016, more and more borders are being policed by civil society. So for example, by teachers, healthcare workers, in banks, landlords, employers, etc., being compelled to act as border guards and checking people's immigration status so that they cannot access what they need to survive without proving their status. So I think what we should be thinking about as climate activists in that context is how that strategy of surveillance and criminalization reflects both contemporarily what's happening in the migrant communities, and in the future how the British state is going to deal with the fact that everything is going to break down essentially due to climate. And some examples of that are that we're seeing how people are being denied healthcare if they don't have the right immigration status. We see that people get no recourse to public funds. So even if they have legal immigration status in the UK, they cannot access any public funds. And that's benefits very crucially, but it's also things like being able to access a refuge if you're escaping domestic violence, homeless shelter if you're rough sleeping, and even free school meals if you're a child living in deprivation. So this is really quite serious and something that we all need to be taking seriously on its own terms, but also in thinking about where is our solidarity and how are we going to organise against the fact that this is only going to get worse. So I'll leave it to Cam to sort of wrap up, and then we can have a broader discussion.
Thanks, Ida. So for all of these reasons, Lesbians engage to support the migrants, organise in solidarity with migrant communities, both here in Britain and internationally. This is because we recognise that the liberation for different communities are tied together, and because the injustice of the border regime and the hostile environment, and because we need to stand in solidarity to win. We are excited to open the floor to all of you and have a good conversation about how we can integrate the climate movement and the anti-racist and internationalist aspects of the migrant and other such movements all together. Yeah, so thank you for joining us.